My name is Ashley Zampogna-Krug. I am a Ph.D. student in the Global History program at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. I am currently in the final stages of my dissertation project, so I've been spending the last month or two editing, and it is on Italian transnationalism in the 1920s and 1930s, and I am hopefully set to graduate at the end of May. I became interested in including Latin America in my research once I discovered that the 1924 Immigration Act that the United States passed had international repercussions that involved immigrant nations in Europe, but also Latin American nations who, due to their relationship with the United States, were influenced in some ways by that policy, but also concerned that the United States would pass further restrictions or other quotas that would be applied to Latin American countries. So once I realized that there was sort of a dialogue happening here, I wanted to discover more and see exactly what was happening between the United States and Latin America in terms of immigration policy at that time. I do focus primarily on Italian communities. I am also interested in sort of multi-ethnic communities that form more in relation to labor movements and also political movements. So another community, or I would consider it an immigrant community, that my work mentions is the anti-fascist community. So and that incorporated Jewish immigrants, some Latin American immigrants. It sort of developed a broad coalition. I do talk in my research briefly about, it's not necessarily in terms of communities, but Mexican immigrants. I more use them to compare Italian deportation and Mexican deportation in the 20s and 30s. So to try to see ways that they're similar, but also ways that they're different during that time. Begins by looking at the 1924 Immigration Act. And historians have looked at this act a ton. They've looked at all the nativist movements and intense nationalism in the United States that led to the passage of this act, which I'll say primarily put pretty strict quotas on the number of Southern and Eastern European immigrants able to enter the United States, also reinforced Chinese exclusion. You know, that's the main point of that act. I am interested in international repercussions from that act. So what happens to immigrant nations like Italy who still have all these populations that want to leave. But then I also realized that Latin American nations are responding to this Immigration Act that the United States passed. And what I found information on a conference that was held in 1928. And as I was looking through, records of that conference, which was on immigration, I realized how closely tied the Pan American Union and the importance that the United States felt in maintaining friendly relations with Latin America became tied into the United States immigration policy, and then also the kinds of policies that Latin American nations were considering at that time as well. And I found that there's this balance that the United States had to play where they were interested in having sovereignty and their absolute, independence in determining their own immigration policy, which at that time was also considering putting quotas on Latin American nations. Well, Latin American nations were not very happy with the possibility of having quotas placed on their immigration, so it became part of this Pan-American dialogue where they said, well, there's things that we have that you're interested in, we don't want this Immigration Quota Act to be considered. So it really influenced, and at that moment, the United States decided, okay, for now we're not going to consider this quota because we do want to maintain these friendly relations, or try to. So I think that's really interesting how they really come melded together, the foreign policy and the immigration policy. Well, directly, there's one example that's in my work of a pretty direct connection between their immigration policy and their relationship. Early in, I want to say as early as 1904, around that time, the United States made efforts to cooperate with the Mexican government in creating a binational immigration policy that would help the United States restrict Europeans who were going to Mexico and then crossing the border into the United States. So there was typically Europeans who were barred for health reasons. So trachoma was a big one. So if they were denied at Ellis Island or any other seaport, they would try to enter again. And the United States was, well, what do we do about, we can't, this is before Border Patrol, so there was no way that they were really monitoring the borders. So there were, through 1904 through about 1907, there were pretty intense negotiations between the United States and Mexico that eventually did result in Mexico passing an immigration act that had stipulations like keeping track of lists of passengers that came through the port of Veracruz, and then they would pass those lists on to immigration officials at different, like in Laredo or El Paso, and then once they had the list, they could determine where they came from, and they used them for those reasons. But then Mexico also passed restrictions on barring immigrants for certain medical diseases that they may have. So whereas Mexico previously did not really monitor immigrants, according to what diseases they had, after these negotiations they began saying, okay, if you have trachoma, no, other sorts of diseases like that. So that's one direct connection where Mexico actually did, alter their policy in relation to these negotiations. Indirectly, what I found, and it's something I would be interested in doing more research on. I have a whole chapter on deportation of Mexican workers, of political radicals, labor leaders in the 20s and 30s, and what I have found is, particularly in the case of Tina Modotti, which I will introduce later, I guess, but she was deported from Mexico in 1929 for being suspected of involvement in the murder of Ortiz Rubio, I believe. And she was deported with other German communists that were also living in Mexico in that time. And I have another example of Mary Louise Doherty, who was an American citizen who worked in Mexico. She was with the Education Department, I believe, in Mexico. And she was also under the threat of deportation for siding with Mexican labor and other things, being suspected of being a political radical. And these pressures for her to be deported came from the United States. So there's an indirect, it's not anything where policy changes or anything like that, but whenever the United States is concerned about political radical activity happening in their southern neighbor, then they seem to put these pressures on, well, to remove these people because there must be a concern that they're going to cross the border into the United States. I don't know, but it's kind of interesting how that conversation kind of crosses the border and influences what happens. Well, Tina Modotti was an Italian immigrant from the Friuli region of Italy, and she originally migrated with her family to San Francisco. And she also spent some time in Los Angeles. And that was about when she was approximately 13 years old. After a few years in San Francisco, she decided to migrate to Mexico and with a few friends, and she ended up living in Mexico City until 1929 when she was booted out for being a radical. And while in Mexico, she became a member of the Communist Party. She was became involved in an anti-fascist movement in Mexico, and she also is a well-known photographer. So she took many pictures of indigenous people in Mexico, of Mexican workers, of the natural beauty of Mexico, and those things. And her photos were featured in exhibits in, I'm not going to remember the specific name, but the National University in Mexico, isn't there a...
the UNAM?
Yes,
UNAM?
I think, and they had an exhibit, an exhibition of her photographs. They were also exhibited in Los Angeles, and also featured in New Masses, which was a labor magazine in New York City, was where it was based, and they featured a lot of her photographs as well. And her photographs really, you mentioned in your question about nation building and how she relates to that, she really became a part of, in Mexico at the time, of sort of celebrating indigenous people and representing Mexican workers and using her photography to make that political statement. She was Xavier Guerrero, she was friends with him, she was friends with Vasconcelos as well, and so was really influenced by those leaders in Mexico and those artists at the time. And in terms of empire, I think of empire, sometimes empire can be a vague term, but I would say her involvement in anti-fascism as being relating to empire because of her stance against Mussolini's need at that time to spread fascism as many places as he could. So there were efforts by him to try to influence Mexico, Argentina, some other nations, and she, through newspaper writing, would protest that anti-fascism. And her relation to immigration, I don't know if she would necessarily say this, but her life experience really exemplifies how immigration changed in this period, how it became highly documented, how it became about securing borders. These things are happening a little, earlier than this, but in the 20s and 30s it becomes much more intense. She faces deportation, which is something that a lot of immigrants at that time experience. She has to go to Europe. She is sort of like a refugee, just floating around Europe. She's detained in the United States. She ends up trying to return to Mexico, but has to return with a false passport, with a false name, and everything. So the things that she goes through are sort of exemplify these changes that are occurring that have come to characterize, certainly in terms of restriction and monitoring and how nations are with their borders and how immigrants then have to relate to that and deal with it and try to still maintain their lifestyle in a way. She really represents that very well, I think. I see transnational as being, you don't necessarily have to physically cross borders or, be a person who has dual citizenship or who has, spent the first half of your life as a citizen in one country and spent the other half in another nation and travel back and forth all your life. Even though that is transnational, I think that to be a transnational migrant or transnational person, it can be more subtle. It doesn't necessarily have to involve you physically crossing that border. Migrants remain transnational by simply retaining correspondence to wherever they came from. They there's a variety of examples of even remittances, maintaining, in the many cases of the Italian immigrants and other transnational migrants, they maintain an interest in the involvements in like political movements, social movements that are happening in the country that they came from. They may not always physically cross the border and go back to that nation, but in other ways through organizations, they maintain in some way an involvement in what's happening over there. And so that is what I see as being transnational. And it's also, I see it as being rooted in a person, not necessarily nation states and things like that. So a person can be transnational by having an interest and having a stake, I think, in more than one nation. And the effects of defining contemporary non-white immigrants as transnational subjects. The key problem that I see, at least in U.S. immigration scholarship, and how current immigration debates happen, there's this break between, we talk about old immigrants and we talk about new immigrants. And the old immigrants are Italians, Poles, Russians, your European immigrants, who the story is came in the early 20th century. They got jobs, they assimilated, they learned English, and now we don't notice them because they're, part of American society. And that's kind of the narrative that follows. And then you have, and that's completely separate from new immigrants. And the narrative that we use, that's portrayed for contemporary non-white migrants is that they maintain their transnational ties. They're not always interested in coming permanently. They'll come for employment reasons, to work. There's other motivations, and there's not always an interest in becoming a permanent citizen. And I think there's a danger in, there are differences between the immigration waves. I mean, it's a different historical context. There are differences. But the problem I see is by seeing them as too different to not notice that there are similarities. That Italian immigrants came purely for employment, to work for 6 months, and then head back to Italy. There's similar motivations, and the immigrants that I am studying maintain transnational connections in many of the same ways that immigrants maintain transnational connections today. So there are those similarities there, and we seem to see, like, immigration debates in particular is what I'm thinking of, seem to portray transnationalism as being a bad thing. That if you come here and you're not 100% willing to bleed red, white, and blue, then you're not as welcome, or it's seen as you're not fully included in national belonging as much if you are. And I just see that as being, if we continue to portray it like that and not recognize past experiences that are actually similar, then I don't, I see that there's not good effects in that portrayal, and I don't know why we see transnationalism as a bad thing, but it just seems to be portrayed that way in the way we talk about immigration today. In the future, I'm interested in expanding my research to incorporate more of Latin America, or to focus more specifically on Latin America than I did in my dissertation. It's incorporated, but it's not the center of the project. So I would like to explore Latin American immigration policy more, and more in depth in terms of the relationship between the United States and Latin America and immigration policy, because I think that there's more of a story there. And I only focus on the 1920s, so I would imagine that there's a lot more happening in terms of that relationship across time. And I'd like to research more on Italian communities in Latin America. I am interested in Italians in Mexico, which nobody talks about, and Italians in Cuba as well. There were a lot of refugees that went to Cuba and Mexico, and they're not really talked about that much, so that's something I'd like to discover more about.